I'm Shanna, and if you're new to this channel, this is all about mostly about pre-med mentorship and non-traditional pathways to medical school. But lately, some stuff we've been doing is a little bit of advocacy work and spreading awareness. And so today I have my amazing classmate Allison here, who wrote a super useful handbook about navigating medical school with hearing loss. I'll link it below in the description. It's super useful, and today she's going to share her story on hearing loss and also some top tips to help medical students with this unique strength thrive in medical school. And also, last of all, some ideas on how all of us can create an accessible environment in many small ways that we can. So, thank you so much, Allison.
No problem. Thank you for inviting me.
Can you tell us a bit about your story?
As Shannon mentioned, I'm a second year medical student at UBC. And just a little bit of a disclaimer, like anything I say today is just like from my own personal experience. So hearing loss is like a very wide spectrum. So my experiences will obviously be tainted to what I've experienced. And also just as a reminder, if you need closed captioning on YouTube, there should be like a little bit of it says CC at the bottom, and you can get the captions there. And so a little bit about myself. I was diagnosed with hearing loss when I was 4 years old. And it was actually my preschool teacher who noticed that something might not be correct. I was pronouncing words a little bit differently. And actually, I was born before they introduced the newborn screening test. So it wouldn't have been picked up on that kind of screening test when I was born. So my parents brought me to an audiologist and an ENT person. So I was diagnosed with hearing loss, and I wear bilateral hearing aids in both ears. And my hearing loss story is that I was really self-conscious about my hearing loss, in that elementary to high school, I actually really refused to wear my hearing aids, and I just pretended I could get by. And if you didn't see me wearing them, you might not have noticed. And I think that really was because I was self-conscious about it. I didn't know anyone in high school who had hearing loss. Sometimes in elementary school, I would be pulled out to do special things. So that was the main thing. And it really changed when I went to university and met other people who were young adults with hearing loss. I felt much more comfortable wearing my hearing aids. I realized how much I was actually missing, and that you don't always have to be out of the loop in a conversation. So I felt much more open to talking about it, and then kind of exploring like what the hearing loss community is all about. And then that leads me to medical school. And then I decided to write this book with the help of other people too, because I realized there's so many tidbits and tips people were giving me that I kind of wanted just to put them into one booklet so other people could read it too. But I'm happy to share anything, and there's really like no question that's off limits. So feel free to ask me or repeat anything.
Yeah, thank you so much for being open and vulnerable and sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't sound easy, and hopefully someone watching this will feel comforted that I think definitely feeling different in any way as a kid is so, even as an adult, as a kid, as an adult is something that makes us different, we will struggle with. So that sounds like relatable in a way that
Yeah.
you wanted to, which sucks. It shouldn't be that way. And I think part of it sounds like when you're that way, it's the way you see yourself, but also if people are treating you different in any way. So it has to be a change coming from other people as well.
Mm-hmm.
Be open and inviting and really friendly and more friendly and curious as to how people are. So, and I'm glad that you were able to find a community of people. Oh, and then I guess something I forgot to mention is in Allison's handbook, um, she mentioned some other associations and youth peer support groups that if you're someone who is experienced this and would love to connect with other people, share tips, or just find a shared community, definitely go check some of these ideas out. So I guess when you came to undergrad, like how or medical school, whichever one's easier, how did you find that like process of like adjusting to school with the addition of hearing loss? How was that?
For my first year of undergrad, so for my BSc, I actually didn't start to wear my hearing aids in my classes because I thought that I could just get by with what I did in high school because the classes are only like 30 kids. But I quickly realized that that's not the case, and I thought that it would make me look different. I had a insecurities being a first year student. But
Mhm.
in reality, like no one cares, and that was just my own thing that I had to deal with. So
Mhm.
for me going into university as a first year student, I always made sure like I sat in the front, wore my hearing aids. Like I had a little microphone that I could use too. I put more thought into the transition going into medical school. So
Mhm.
I really reached out to people who I knew had hearing loss. I also, I have my stethoscope. So you'll know that you'll probably recognize what a traditional stethoscope looks like. So I did a lot of research on like what I wanted out of a stethoscope. So this is actually just mine. I don't know if you see that.
Ooh.
Um,
Mhm.
yeah. So this is basically, I'll hook up to my hearing aids. Um,
Mhm.
so that was something like a transition, trying to research what to do.
Was there anything that moments or things that motivated you? Because I think that's a really like a amazing change you were able to make from feeling self-conscious to it. Was there anything that triggered or motivated you to make that change to feeling more comfortable and then wanting to kind of change from hiding to like, you know what, I'm gonna do it. And I'm gonna even be proactive to the next level when you hit med school. But like, I'm gonna proactively figure out how to ace life, with by figuring out how to do it well.
So I wanted to volunteer at a school with hearing loss, and there's a school in Vancouver. And I'm talking to the principal, and then I was talking about how I really didn't know anyone as a young adult who had hearing loss, and she connected me to some people who were part of the, before I get the name wrong, it's the BC Youth Peer Support Program, and it's for young adults and youth. And I met people who were my age, so in their 20s with hearing loss, and that was really the trigger. Because I
Mhm.
saw myself in them, and I felt very comfortable, and seeing how they advocated for themselves and were confident, that was really the difference. And I think that's why my transition to medical school wasn't as big compared to my transition to starting university during my first degree,
Mhm.
because I felt much more comfortable talking about hearing loss and saying like what I needed in order to succeed.
Mhm. What kind of support or community was the youth peer support program able to provide for you?
So if you're younger and I think you're in high school, they do like social activities, which is really fun. And then they also do social activities for like young adults too. So just meeting people. They have a really good community support, so you can reach out to like the working young professionals, and if you have a question, something like, "Oh, how did you disclose to an employer?" or "Did you disclose?" They can kind of provide their own feedback, but it's really just a way to have a contact because sometimes you feel like there's no one else out there.
Mhm.
But having a central place, being like, "Hey, I need help on this," and someone can connect to you in that. So if you email them, they have like people they can connect you to. They have like social activities, which are fun.
Mhm. Was there any help that you were able to get during the pre-med process? Did hearing loss cause any extra challenges in the experience of like, any of the MCAT, the interviews, etc.?
For the UBC application, I think you can check off a box that says, "Are you an applicant applying with a disability?" and that allows you to get accommodations.
Mhm.
My main worry for the whole application process was the interviews,
Mhm.
because like the writing part, that's fine. I don't really need to listen to anything.
Mhm.
But the interviews, I was more concerned about like, could I hear the person talking, or if they had a video, would there be captions?
Mhm.
So I requested certain accommodations for that interview process, like for them to repeat themselves. I wanted them to know I had hearing loss, that in case I asked them to repeat themselves, it wasn't interpreted as being rude. Because in my past experience, if someone didn't know I had hearing loss and I said, "Oh, could you repeat that?" or "Excuse me," that was interpreted as being rude.
Wow.
So yeah, so I just wanted, so that was the main thing I asked for my interviews.
Sometimes we are quick to jump and judge when we don't remember a person's context. When we're like, why is this person asking me to repeat themselves? Or why are we asking all these like things that are actually not hard for us to do, but we make a fuss on it when we don't realize that this could be really important. And it's
Yeah,
a small move on our part to make.
yeah, like, and I think that also comes back to like myself. Like sometimes I didn't want to disclose, and you don't have to disclose if you don't want to.
Mhm.
But I don't think like I told one of my teachers in elementary school. It was in PE. And then in PE there's like balls bouncing everywhere.
Mhm.
And I got a really bad grade in PE one time, and I couldn't understand why. And it said bad attitude, like doesn't listen. So then my mom went up to my teacher and was like, "Oh, like I'm really concerned because in her other classes she's not getting that, and if it's a bad attitude, like we should probably look into that." And
Mhm.
the teacher was like, "Oh, well, when I call her name, she doesn't respond." But that's just because I couldn't hear her. But she wasn't told that I had hearing loss. So it goes both ways. People need to be open to understanding, and also like I need to advocate if I really need something and it's hindering me.
Mhm. So I guess for anyone who is watching this and ends up being a teacher or you're helping out with classes and stuff, and because Allison figured out I was at 4 years old, but there are definitely because there's a spectrum, some people can not know they have a condition or it's a little bit more mild until later on. Is maybe figure out, maybe chat and figure out if you're like, hey, were you hearing this? And also maybe digging into maybe they need to be screened and see an audiologist and just understand instead of jumping to labeling a kid as a bad attitude. And I think that applies to hearing loss. I think this applies to kids with attention difficulties and other things that we are quick to judge and label kids as bad attitude or not paying attention when we don't realize. So,
Yeah, I think that it's really different for everyone. So like I went through a phase where I was like really uncomfortable and then became more comfortable.
mhm,
But that's having me been diagnosed when I was 4. But then there's some people I know who were diagnosed in their 20s and they're learning it through. So yeah, it's really different for everyone.
mhm,
It's kind of hard to paint like a big stroke, and the different like um, levels of hearing loss too.
for
That's
sure.
what makes it so complex. Yeah.
As you evolved and became more comfortable with it, how did I guess your friends kind of evolve with you?
Like when I was younger and like kind of now.
Mhm,
Yeah, I had very, very supportive friends in elementary and high school.
mhm,
In elementary school, I think it was a little bit more obvious that I had hearing loss because I had a teacher like wear a special microphone, and like my parents did a lot of the advocacy work for me, and I had like a special teacher.
mhm,
And like though it was, I had a very good elementary school experience. I think in high school it's a bit different. I
mhm,
didn't want to wear my hearing aids at all,
mhm,
and I only wore them for French because I had a really hard time hearing and learning a second language. And I would take them out immediately just
mhm.
because I felt more self-conscious. I think going through that high school adolescent period, you're just wondering like, what are other people thinking about you?
Yeah.
Um, but then that changed in high school and university when I met people my age. So yeah, generally I think that's a good point. Like finding people that really support you.
Mhm,
Um, um, and can help advocate for you. So like if I was with friends and they knew, like if we were cooking at like someone's house, something as simple as like turning off the fan that when you used to cook
mhm.
can make a huge difference. But like if someone doesn't know that you have hearing loss and they're trying to talk to you with a fan on, it can be very hard. But it's kind of nice to have someone knowing that you have hearing loss and being like, oh, I'm just going to turn the fan off and then I can talk to you.
How did your friends try to go about like learning or educating, or was it most of the learning they kind of intuitively like, oh, I should do this, or did you like, hey, you would suggest this?
Mm. But more in university too. Like a lot of my friends, they've been very good. Like they just know like when they're talking to me, just like to look at me. Sometimes I've had friends been like, "Oh, like, did you catch that? If it's like a group dynamic and someone's like talking as a huge group and I don't really hear it."
Yeah.
And like if I ask someone to repeat themselves, they don't get frustrated, which is kind of sometimes like a little hypocritical of me because sometimes I get frustrated if I have to repeat myself. So that's something that I need to work on, which is kind of ironic. But yeah, people have been like, it's really important to find your people and they support you.
Already, but were there any other things that you had wished you had come to a realization on sooner or you had adopted sooner?
I mean, I kind of mentioned it before, but I think for me, it was like I cared too much what I thought other people thought about me.
Mhm,
And I think that was like a common theme in my like teenage years. Thought that if I wore hearing aids, I would look stupid or I would be different. But
mhm,
in reality, like I don't think anyone cares. Like, and if they do care, then they have a very poor outlook. And I've had people in high school who would make fun of the way I talked because growing up, I went to a speech language pathologist, an SLP, and that's someone who kind of helps you like enunciate words. But I stopped that in like when I was older and in high school.
mhm,
And like I've had people comment, and then I would get really self conscious about that,
mhm,
and sometimes I would kind of shy away from public speaking. But in reality, you know what? Like everyone talks differently, so it doesn't matter. So for me, I kind of wished sooner that I wouldn't have cared so much what I thought other people thought about me, because I really missed out, I think, a lot. Like
Mhm,
I probably could have done better in French if I like actually advocated for what I wanted. So,
mhm.
for example, it's hard for me to listen like from a stereo, and a lot of our French tests
Oh,
were
yeah.
like a CD, and then they played it on the stereo, and like I never asked my teacher if I could sit closer to the stereo, or actually asked her, "Could you read me the oral test so I can see your face, I can read your lips?" And I just kind of suffered through like 3 years of
Mhm.
getting a bad grade in French because I didn't know, I didn't feel comfortable saying anything. But in retrospective, that if I was taking French again, I would know like these are the things that I that help me hear better, um, and I need to ask for that because sometimes people don't know all the time.
Mhm. I think it's also understandable at that age when we're like, when we're like in grade 8, 9, 10, like nobody teaches us that it's okay to ask for things. Usually we're just the receiver of the environment. And as a youth, you don't really realize that you can ask, you can change the environment. So I
Hmm.
think for the time and place you were um, the learning, like there wasn't a chance for you to know that you could even ask for accommodation.
And like
Yeah.
I do know, I have some friends who are teachers,
Yeah.
like hearing loss teachers. So they actually help kids in school with hearing loss.
Yeah.
So I think and they have those sort of like contacts. So if you do get connected to that, those people will also help you advocate for different things.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I was gonna say, like, I think on one hand, I'm like so much respect for where you're at and you evolved and you're on the advocacy train now. But if anyone's listening and you're younger, and you're not brave in that, like, I hope you will get there. But I'm also I hope you feel comfortable that and not ashamed that maybe you're not at that stage completely comfortable yet, and that's okay too. So like
Yeah,
every
it took me like 20 plus years. So
yeah, it's
sometimes it didn't take a long time, but for me, it took a really long time.
okay to be at a journey wherever like I think like one perception that I have with there's hearing loss. I think there's mental health. There's like all sorts of struggles that people go through. I think it's amazing that some people are open to sharing, and thank you for sharing again. But I think some people it's okay that not everyone feels like they have to be at that peak of super comfortable and they're like advocating and sharing their story, because it's a hard thing to do, and it's just part of it's like one part of the person. And especially if you're younger, if you're still here and trying to figure out how you feel about it and evolving, that's okay. Like
Mhm.
it's
I
always
would say, like, if you're younger and you're watching this, like, don't, for whatever, like, adversity or unique ability you think you have, I don't think it's anything negative. Like, if you're interested in applying for medical school or any sort of program or jobs,
mhm,
there's really nothing that you can't do. There's always a way that you can adapt to something. So I was lucky to be surrounded by, like, people, like, mentors who I felt really encouraged me to just go after whatever I wanted. So I didn't really think that hearing loss would ever keep me back from medicine. I just knew that I would have to kind of tweak things. So if you're ever afraid that like something will hold you back, I don't think it is. Like we had people in my class with so many different stories, and
mhm,
you look at them and it's like it's so inspiring. I was reflecting and I was trying to think about like what would I want to know if I was younger or someone entering a new program or a new phase in their life. So my first tip would be to advocate for yourself. So you know best how you hear and how you learn, and this can take some time. So, for example, for me, I know I hear best when someone is like talking to me face to face. I can see their facial expressions, um, and people aren't going to know how to communicate necessarily unless I ask them to.
mhm,
So you can't always assume that everyone's going to be well versed in knowing how to communicate with someone who has hearing loss. So if you need someone to repeat themselves, like you can say in a way um, that doesn't necessarily have to disclose your condition. You could say, "Hey, I'm having a hard time hearing you. Do you mind just repeating that?"
mhm,
Um, for medical school, I really met with student affairs is kind of like this overarching part of the faculty that really helps advocate for accommodation. So I met with them. I met with my student diversity or accessibility advisor, and we came up with things that I needed to learn. So like usually an amplified stethoscope isn't allowed in an examination room. but I advocate, I need this. It's not being pushy or being bossy to ask for something. And I think that was something that I thought when I was younger, if I asked for something, it was being pushy, but that's not. If you need something and it's going to help you learn better and help you better serve patients, then yes, like you're well within your means to advocate for yourself. And there's laws for that too. So
Mhm,
don't be afraid to do that.
and
My
then
second, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna just chime in and say stuff like, so our student affairs or whatever that is, your access and diversity, if you're at UBC in undergrad, or honestly your colleagues, your classmates, your teachers, most people, I want to say all, but most people want you to learn. They're here, they're excited, and they want you to get the best learning out of your opportunities. So in reality, I think most people want to be able to help you. So they would be happy to hear you how they can best help you.
So my second tip is share what you feel comfortable sharing. So this was something I reflected a lot on prior to entering medical school in first year. I was thinking, oh, do I tell people? Do I tell who do I tell? Do I tell everyone I meet? Do I tell patients? Do I tell my classmates? And for me, it really depends on the situation and the people I'm with. So I thought at the beginning of medical school, like, oh, maybe I should tell all my patients because I don't want them to think I'm rude if I ask them to repeat themselves.
Mhm,
Um, but then I reflected on it and I was like, I don't want to start the patient encounter right away, like based on me.
mhm,
And if I feel like I can communicate with them without saying anything, then that's totally fine.
mhm,
So typically right now for patient encounters, I don't say anything. And if I'm having a hard time hearing them, then I'll say, I'm having a hard time getting all the information. I want to make sure what I'm writing down is correct. Could you repeat that?
mhm,
Or could you speak a little louder or could you speak a little slower? Um, so that's one. So that's one I don't necessarily feel comfortable sharing. Just because I feel like sometimes I want to keep a little bit more like distance from the patient in that way.
yeah,
But then there's times where a patient has asked me about my stethoscope, and I feel completely comfortable then saying, "Oh yeah, I just use it to hook up to my hearing aid." And sometimes they feel comfort um, in like asking questions. And I haven't really encountered any patient that had like been like, "Oh no, I don't want you to see me."
mhm,
But I'm still only well, I'm entering third year, so that might I don't. From what I've heard, patients have been very kind and nice.
no,
Um, and on the flip side, though, when I'm in CBL, which is case based learning, so in medical school at UBC, we had these small pods where you work through a case. And oftentimes you're in a room and you're writing up on a whiteboard. And sometimes when you're writing, like you're facing away from the person.
mhm,
So, and actually, in all my CBL groups, when we do our introductions, like, hey, I'm Allison, I just add a quick note and I say, oh, hey, I'm Allison. Um, I have hearing loss. So, if I ask you to repeat yourself, that's the reason why. And if I'm on the board and you guys say something that you want me to include, I might not hear it because I'm not facing you. So, just say it louder or repeat yourself. I say it to that because like I feel very comfortable with my peers. I
mhm,
think it's helpful to also have people in your class know that you have hearing loss so they can kind of be mindful of that. So that's my second tip is to summarize, like only share what you feel comfortable with.
mhm,
Um, you should never feel forced to disclose something and no one should ever disclose for you. That's one
mhm.
thing too. Yeah.
That's a good one. That's a
Mm,
good one. I think that's a trap. Even speaking for myself, and I think of others is like it's a temptation to be like, hey, like you need to repeat yourself or speak up and like step in. But I think it's sometimes it's more appropriate to let whoever wants to decide because, as you said, there's ways of asking to speak up without necessarily disclosing. And it's a very personal choice. So learning to hang back the rest of
yeah.
us to give people agency, which I think is, and I think for healing loss, and I've worked with others with visual disabilities, is that's something that is difficult that a lot of people like to remove agency from
Hmm.
people just because they have one thing that a lot of people want to step in or do things for people when it's up to a person. So that's
Exactly.
can be more mindful of. And I think commenting on your patient one, I think that's totally okay. And what I see from this is actually you have a lot of consideration that you're trying to be mindful that you want to keep the focus on the patient and the patient's condition today. Um,
Mhm.
and then
But there's some people who do like to disclose, and I'm not trying to like taint anything that, but like if it ever came to the case where I really couldn't hear the patient and like they were getting kind of like annoyed, then I might probably disclose and say, you know what, like I have hearing loss. I really want to make sure that I'm getting your information correct. Like if you always center it around the patient, I don't think you can ever go wrong with that.
To disclose. I think a lot of our teaching, our clinical skills just happened. We had a few that had hearing loss, and then they would be like, "Well, I didn't bring my hearing aids. I'm gonna start off and just tell you that."
Hmm.
And then some that choose to say like they have forgotten their aids today, but then they don't tell you until halfway. They're like, you know what? A few of you have voices that are just a little too quiet, too soft in manner of speaking.
Hmm.
I just want to tell you, by the way, I need you to speak up. So
Yeah.
even with patients, they'll make different choices, and I think it doesn't really matter whichever one you do. I think it depends on the
Yeah.
situation.
That's a great point, actually. Like, so though people like advocated for what they needed, which is great because oftentimes like higher pitched voices, so often like in female voices, it can be harder to hear. So sometimes as a person, if you're like the one interviewing someone, you're like, oh, am I doing something wrong? But having someone just say like, oh, repeat yourself because it's on me, then that's totally cool.
So hopefully, like culture-wise or environment-wise, we make it open both ways for people to just
Hmm.
express what they need. I know it's not that way, and I know patients feel intimidated even asking the doctor or even the student doctor, and I think it goes the other way too. That you're like, oh, is this appropriate? But hopefully that's the way we can make the culture.
Third tip is view your hearing loss as something that is unique and not necessarily something that is going to hold you back. So, for example, for me, I didn't think that hearing loss would hold me back when I was applying to medical school. But kind of like in first and second year, I was like, ooh, we were learning about heart murmurs, which is basically like your heart can make a different sound if something is like structurally or functionally abnormal in your heart.
Mhm.
And I was having a really hard time hearing the heart murmurs. And then like you would all be listening to it on someone's heart and like, okay, yeah, I hear it. And I was like, I don't hear anything. Um, and that was the one kind of time where I thought like, oh, this might hold me back. But then I viewed it as something like, oh no, it's just gonna take me a little bit different how to learn it. So like listening to YouTube um, videos more, downloading an app, and then realizing like everyone has a hard time hearing a heart murmur. so, um, so one thing is that like at that point I was kind of like, oh, I'm not really totally loving my hearing loss right now because it's making it a little bit harder.
Mhm.
But then I try to be like, you know what, the hearing loss is actually something that is like a bonus because for me, I've had a long time to reflect on how to communicate with someone because I like it when people put that consideration into it too. So one time I found that my hearing loss was like a bonus was that I met a patient at family practice who was who was older and had hearing loss, and I felt I was able to communicate well with this patient because I kind of already knew the things to do to
Mhm.
look them directly in the face, to instead of like saying something. So sometimes if you ask a question and then they don't hear it and then you repeat the same thing, it can be harder. So it might actually be better to rephrase it. So for example, if you're saying, oh, how are you today? Or what brings you in? And they don't hear you, rephrase it in a different way. Like, what can I do for you today? Or don't repeat the exact same words because they might have a hard time hearing those specific sounds in those words. Um, so I think that like my hearing loss has made me much more considerate about communication with others, which I feel like a lot of patients will appreciate. And just being mindful, like we saw a patient in a hospital one time, um, and he was like sleeping, and I noticed hearing aids on the side of his bed, and I was like, oh, we should probably put in his hearing aids before we talk to him. But that might not be something that I would have known about if I didn't have hearing loss too.
Mhm.
So to summarize, the three tips I have are one, to advocate for yourself, um, to two, to share what you feel comfortable sharing, and then three, to view your hearing loss as like a bonus, a plus. It's not something that is going to hold you back. There will be challenges, but I think that with the right support and the right people by your side, it's really possible.
Mhm. And I would say, Allison, for sure. I feel like, not just because you have hearing loss, but I think as what you were before and enhanced by the hearing loss, I feel like you are an incredibly considerate person. Like being in CBL with you, you really notice, and you seem to notice and pick up when someone's like yeah, they seem to be like, yeah, like for me, sometimes like if I get like stomped on into the conversation or I'm feeling off, I think you have this very um, natural tendency to want to make sure everyone's being like heard or they're, it seems like their needs are not being met or they're uncomfortable. And so I think, yeah,
Oh, thanks. But in the time of COVID, I have a little public service announcement. So, like, when you're talking like this, it's really hard sometimes to understand what I'm saying because you can't see my mouth.
hmm
And that essentially is like what a mask does. Like, masks are important. We need to wear them.
hmm
But it does make it challenging for people who have hearing loss and rely on lip reading. Not everyone uses sign language. Like, I personally never learned to use sign language. So just being mindful that during communications now with the wider spread use of masks is that you might have to talk a little bit louder. You
hmm
might have to, oh, maybe socially distance and then they can see your face.
hmm So
But
like go back and then remove.
yeah, there are masks with like a clear window, and I
Mhm,
kind of outlined those in the handbook.
mhm,
They don't really have like an N95 version of that, and
mhm,
I'm not really too sure about the accessibility, the widespread accessibility of those clear masks. But yeah, just something to be mindful of. I know that can sometimes cause a lot of anxiety.
mhm,
I know for me personally, like for I'm worried about my surgery block. So
mhm,
surgery, like when we're scrubbed in, so like everyone will be in eye goggles and a mask, and the OR rooms can be loud with like, especially have like machines going. Um, so can just if you're someone who doesn't have hearing loss, just be mindful of communicating with a mask and
mhm.
maybe checking like, oh, did you want me to repeat that? Stuff like that. Yeah.
I wanted to ask Allison some questions on how we can all work together to create a more accessible environment for our classmates, colleagues, patients, you name it. So I guess my first one was kind of the when is when we realize that a fellow medical student has hearing loss. Um, Even though they're highly capable of all the situations, they have the agency to ask and advocate for themselves, and we don't want to step in on that. Are there any situations where it is appreciated just to check in whether or not we can offer to advocate or offer an accommodation?
Depends on the person and your relationship with them. I'm pretty open with my friends and my family about it, so they kind of like check in, like, "Oh, did you catch that?" Or like, my partner is really supportive if we're in a big group environment.
Mhm,
Kind of knows now when I don't pick something up, and then he'll repeat it, which is really lovely.
mhm,
Um, so the question is like, how can we support those? Yeah, I think if you have a good relationship with a person,
mhm,
and they've like told you that they've had hearing loss,
mhm,
um, you can always ask them like, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" Or like, "Do you like need me to repeat anything?" But I think people you'll kind of get a hint if they're not hearing you correctly, and then you can offer it. Or for example, like if you're communicating with someone and the fan is on, just like turn it off. Like be mindful of those things.
mhm,
Um, Talking to someone face to face, don't look away, that kind of stuff.
mhm. So is there like some of the suggestions? Because I guess some of us worry about checking in, as you said, without being patronizing. So you would just say like, "Hey, did you catch that?" and just doing a casual, like I was just thinking like, is there? It sounds maybe silly. Is there like a particular wording that's friendly as
Oh,
patronizing?
yeah. When someone does it maybe a little bit more privately. Like if you're in a big group discussion, that's where I struggle because sometimes there's so many voices going around. And then I might have someone like if we're walking somewhere else, they said, "Oh, did you catch that?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's fine."
Mhm,
Um, so maybe make it not like one thing to do, like not make it in a big public group because then that's kind of like disclosing a little bit.
mhm,
Um, I don't think you need to like routinely ask someone because hopefully they'll kind of tell you and they maybe that's not their style, but
mhm,
I don't necessarily know if there's any sort of wording.
mhm,
I would just take your cue and the social cues if you can kind of see when someone's struggling.
mhm.
Oh, I think I went to an event one time where they didn't have a microphone.
Ooh.
Yeah, which is kind of tough because it's hard to hear in the back. And I had one friend, and then she like put up her hand and was like, "Oh, can we like turn on a microphone? It's really hard to hear in the back," which was really lovely because like it's kind of saying like, yeah, it's hard for everyone to hear, but like I really needed that microphone too.
Mhm,
So it's kind of something like if you that's a way to like advocate for others too. Like
mhm.
stuff like that makes hearing more accessible for everyone.
All that jazz. Are there any other situations that to be more mindful of.
If anyone here is like planning events, to think about accessibility, and I think that like maybe I think online you can like Google like accessibility checklist, and there's things to think about, like not just hearing loss too, but like is your venue like wheelchair accessible? Does your venue have like gender neutral washrooms? And these are things to kind of think about.
I think if you get to UBC Med, Allison and other people are part of this group within medical students and upper years if you want to connect with people within the class. And then,
Yes, this is a little bit more like healthcare related. Rounding. So rounding is something that you do like in a hospital or in a care team,
mhm,
which is basically where you kind of like walk around, I think, with your team, and
mhm,
like you have a little conversation and then you move around.
mhm,
Um, so like, oh, if you're in like a hospital team, it can be really hard to hear because there's like so many ambient noises. There's machines going off. There's like people walking.
mhm,
So if you're in a hospital team and you know that someone in your group might have hearing loss or they've told you,
mhm,
like look to them when you're talking. Maybe try to find a quieter place to like have your group discussion, because like if you're talking about different things and like lab values and someone might not hear it, then that's also patient safety too.
mhm,
So my plan is to just see how it goes, and then like I might find someone in my team and be like, oh, I have a hard time hearing, like if I come to you after, can I just double check what I wrote down is correct?
mhm,
So just being open to that if you're like a team member on a medical team that does rounding.
mhm. And then you had another example on talking on the phone. I can see just thinking of that right away. That's challenging for both the provider or the healthcare provider as well as the patient. If they
Yeah,
sort of
so this is a little bit more challenging. Like talking on the phone can be easier or more difficult for some people. So um, I don't use my hearing aids when I talk on the phone because it provides some sort of like weird feedback. But then on my cell phone, I have it directly connect to my hearing aids. So again, but like an old school phone, I have a hard time, and that's mostly what we use in the hospital.
yeah.
So I was told by some upper years, like, and by a nurse I know too, is like if you're having a hard time hearing someone over the phone because they call you for an order,
Mhm,
if you feel comfortable and you're really not understanding what they're saying, you can be like, can I quickly meet with you face to face? Or can you text it to me if there's no like patient identification? Just because you don't really want to get like a dose wrong, or you don't want to get a name wrong or a number wrong.
mhm,
Um, but if you're on the other end and you're communicating with someone who you know has hearing loss and they told you, being mindful of that. So I know that a nurse said to me like, oh, one time someone even offered just to meet up with me or to like text me the dose and the prescription. Um, and that was just kind of nice. Like someone had thought about that, because it can be really hard to communicate over the phone because you're not seeing the person. And some people really rely, I do, on like a face to face communication. And sometimes it's not that people don't like aren't considerate or they're being rude. Like some people just don't realize too. Like there's many things that I don't think about or I take for granted as like someone, other different things like wheelchair accessibility. Like I don't have to think twice about if there's stairs or not when I go somewhere. So if you do come across a situation where you feel like it could be made more accessible, like, and you feel comfortable, you could always bring it up to that person and like, these are things changes that we can make. Like there was people in our class who was like, you know what, like there's no gender neutral washroom in our lecture halls, and then they made that change, which is kind of cool. But if anyone like wants to reach out to me, my email's in that handbook on either the first or the second page. I'm always happy to talk to anyone, you know, wanting to apply to medicine or want to talk about hearing loss. Feel free to reach out.
Amazing. Well, thank you for offering that, Allison. And again, thank you so much for taking time to share us your story and take your time to really think about like the tips and answer these last questions. So it's been a pleasure. Um,
Thanks for having me.
I'm trying to integrate more of this kind of awareness and just knowing a bit of more, like showcasing more diversity in medicine in future videos. So if you guys like that, let me know in the comments. And then hopefully intermixing this back with some, just regular med content. So, anyways, hopefully you guys enjoy this video. Bye from me and Allison.